deep dive into the Ukraine situation with Russia. It's a war. And it's one that I have to say, I have never experienced or witnessed so much propaganda directed at citizenry in my lifetime, even through the Iraq War, which was pretty heavily propagandized. Do I start again? I was getting...
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, sorry about that, everybody.
Sorry, Trish.
I was getting a little bit of interference in my headphones, and frankly, I'm not smart enough to do both, so I could never be an anchor lady, but, well, maybe I could, but not at CNN. Anyway, here we go again. Sorry, Joe and Patrick, technical issues.
Not at all. Not
Yeah,
at all.
sorry. So we're going to start again. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Trish Wood here. So what we're going to talk about today and what we're going to do is a very, very much needed deep dive with two reporters, journalists, columnists who I respect very much, because I'm feeling, I think like most of you, that we are being propagandized in a way, it's almost historic in a Western democracy, what they are doing to us in the mainstream media, in the printed media, on legacy television. I mean, it's actually unbearable, and it makes me feel a little bit sick to my stomach. I could not watch the Joe Biden State of the Union last night, because I knew it would be so over the top with dishonesty that I wouldn't be able to sleep. And I knew I had to do this morning, so I didn't watch it last night. I watched it this morning. My point is that the show today is to move around this fire hose of lies and propaganda that has infected the conversation about Ukraine. Fortunately for them, Ukraine is a pretty complicated country with a very complicated history. And I will admit, I myself have been a little bit asleep at the wheel. Foreign policy is not my thing, but I do know who I trust. And when this happened, I did a pretty big sort of reading day and video watching day to get back up to speed. And what I was seeing from people I trust, like Steve Cohen, who I talk about a lot, was not what was being represented at all in the mainstream media coverage. And here is something I think none of us can forget today, and that is that we still live in a nuclear age, folks, and we need serious people making serious decisions that will protect the citizenry and not mucking about in foreign policy in ways that may improve their image or change the subject or whatever it is they're doing. I cannot fathom what is actually going on in Washington, D.C. these days. I just don't get it. We had a president last night who actually suggested, I believe, that Kiev is in Iran. I mean, it's just completely nuts. All the while provoking Russia. That's what they've been doing. They've done nothing to tamp this down. They've been provoking. So we have today two people who are way, way smarter than I am on foreign affairs in generally and Ukraine specifically. One of them, the gentleman you'll see on the screen there, is his name is Joe Lauria, and he is with the news site Consortium News, which is one that I push a fair bit. I have a critical list on my website of trusted, what I call trusted news sources, Joe Lauria. And he's written for a lot of very high-profile publications. That's Joe. And you don't see Patrick Lawrence, who also is with Consortium and had a big career offshore. He was at the Far Eastern Economic Review, which I have a lot of respect for. I've actually known people who work there. And it's very, very highly regarded in certain circles of serious people. The International Herald Tribune, the New Yorker, and he's written a few books too. So here we go. I'm going to start with you, Joe. And I guess did you watch Joe Biden last night? Could you stand it?
I understand your feelings, but I did have to watch it, yes.
Yeah, and what tell me what your response is to
I found, to me, it was like a celebration. And a passing on of their own sins of aggression onto the great Satan, Vladimir Putin. It was a scary, eerie experience, especially one, and don't forget, this is the top political elite of the country, including the Supreme Court, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of course, both houses of Congress, members of the administration, and they start chanting USA, USA, USA. So, it's chilling. I despise that chant, especially coming from political, powerful people like that. What your introduction, I'll tell you why it sounded like a celebration to me. Because in your introduction, you're absolutely right. The way the media has been covering the Ukraine story for 8 years has been abominable, and it's mostly what they're leaving out. Yeah. And this story began in 2014 with the United States backed coup d'etat against Viktor Yanukovych, who was an elected president of Ukraine and certified by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. He was a legitimate president. He chose an economic package from Russia over the one from the EU. And that caused enormous protests to gather in front of his palace and in the main square, Maidan. And we have a tape recording of Victoria Nuland, who was at that time was the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. And she was speaking with the American ambassador at the time, Jeffrey Piot. And this was before this happened. They were discussing who was going to be inside the new Ukrainian government. So this is a smoking gun that the U.S. was involved in a coup. There's other evidence. John McCain went down there and stood on the stage talking to the protesters, riling them up. She was there, Nuland, in the street.
And there's actually footage of them in the street with the protesters. Right? I've seen that footage. Yeah,
that would be like a senior member of the Duma in Russia and a high-level foreign ministry official coming to occupy Wall Street and calling on the people in Lower Manhattan to overthrow the U.S. government. Yeah. And we have the conversation where they were actually talking about who would make up the new government. So the coup took place in 2014. And of course, Ukraine is quite divided. The east is largely ethnic Russian, and the west, especially towards far west Galicia, are Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian rather than Russian. Two provinces in the far east, a sliver really on the eastern edge of Ukraine that borders on Russia, Donetsk and Lugansk, they said they would not be part of this coup regime. They voted for Yanukovych. This is not democracy. They were defending democracy, and they wanted to be separate from Ukraine. They declared their independence. Same thing happened in Crimea. It was in Crimea that Russia accepted and recognized that they wanted to join Russia and not to become an independent state, as those two provinces did. There was a long process, but it didn't take very long. There was a referendum in Crimea. They joined Russia again. That's portrayed as a Russian invasion, like the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
Hitler took it over. The two provinces in the east asked for independence. They had a referendum. They wanted Russia to recognize them. Russia refused for 8 years. Now, what happened in these 8 years?
This is this is the Minsk agreement you're talking about, right?
It's going to, yeah, that's right. But the new coup government led by Petro Poroshenko sent the army of Ukraine to kill these people, basically, to shell them, to murder them. And there's been 14,000 killed over 8 years. And what emerged was, as some of the most fierce fighters in the coup in 2014 and in this war against Donbass, that's the region of those two provinces, were literal Nazis. The Azov battalion using Nazi swastika-like symbols. There are Nazis in Ukraine. There are not a large number of them. They don't do very well electorally in politics, but they have power over the government, pressure over the military. So for 8 years,
I just want to. We'll get back to Nazis in a minute, because I think that's a really important point. And when I sort of first heard those claims, I was on the fence about it. I mean, can that be real? And then, of course, it turned out to be true, because I wasn't reading enough foreign policy stuff. So let's get back to the Nazis in a minute, and I'll let you finish your point. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. So about a year after this killing in the East started happening, there was an agreement worked out that was guaranteed by Germany and France. It was done in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, and that was the Minsk agreements. And the agreement essentially were that those two provinces would remain inside of Ukraine, but would be autonomous. For 8 years, the U.S., Germany and France did not pressure the Ukrainian government to implement that accord. Russia was waiting for 8 years for that to happen. It never did. this week what I consider to be a trap that was set by the United States for Russia. And I'd like to talk about that more later. They started an offensive again, very strong shelling. According to OSCE statistics, most of the shelling was going into this enclave, and Russia decided then, after presenting these treaties to the U.S. and Russia, and so the United States, to stop the expansion of NATO eastward. That's another big part of the story. Russia recognized those two republics, and on Thursday sent the troops in. And we could talk about the course of the war now, but that's the basic background. We don't hear any of this in the mainstream.
None of it.
Media. That's what I wanted, the point I wanted to make. The 8-year war, excuse me, 8-year war that Russia is entering, and Putin said he wanted to end this war, not start a war. So this war has been going on for 8 years.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I have to say frequently when I'm exploring this subject with people that I'm not pro-Putin, right? It's ridiculous that you have to say that, but you do, because the narrative now, as it's been woven, and you well know this, Joe and Patrick, that you're either for Putin or you're against him, which is sort of how America runs its foreign policy anyway. It's ridiculous because I am feeling very scared, and my being frightened is about the fact that I see people around the world cheering on Zelensky's absurd calls for the citizens to take up arms in a conflict like this. You don't ask your citizens to take up arms. People are posing fashionably with, rifles and, in their business suits. It's all like, we know it's a huge PR campaign, but Zelensky is playing this to inflame the world. And I don't think that what he's doing is going to have a good outcome either for the citizens in Ukraine or the rest of the world who may be dragged into some extremely dangerous, existentially threatening conflict.
If you're still speaking to me, I totally agree with you. That was highly irresponsible to have weapons passed out to people where gangs could be shooting one another. Ukraine has the second largest military there, I think, in Europe after Russia. So this is not a country without arms. And NATO, which is a big part of the story, has been pouring arms into Ukraine for the last year or so. I mean, really pouring them in, especially in the last weeks, as the U.S. started going crazy about Russian invasion. And NATO, it's a de facto NATO country because they have these weapons. They come and they have exercises there. They train them. This is another thing that the Russians demand, that they never become a member of NATO. This is a virulently anti-Russian state with literal neo-Nazis, part of the National Guard. They're not fringe, on the border with Russia. A country that was invaded, of course, in the 19th century by the biggest power, Napoleon, and in the 20th by Hitler, the largest power in Europe. And they defeated both. The Russian psyche is about defending against a similar invasion from the West. Americans don't understand this because America has never been invaded in that way at all. And the idea of putting that kind of a Nazified government and state right up against the borders is part of Brzezinski's plan. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, in his 1997 book, Grand Chessboard, said, if you take Ukraine away from the Soviets, from the Russians, then it ceases to be a European power and it becomes a backwater. So getting Ukraine was really important for them. And I'm going to talk later, at least, about what I think was this trap. By starting the offensive, drawing Russia in, they had to choose whether to go into Ukraine to stop this offensive or not do anything. And then by having that invasion, the Americans, I believe, were popping corks of champagne. And that's the celebratory feeling I had last night at the Congress, because in order to put these unbelievably harsh sanctions that are designed to cripple the economy and bring down Putin, that's the end game here. They needed them to invade. Because you cannot just put, obviously, these kinds of sanctions on a country without a good reason. They've orchestrated worldwide condemnation as well against Russia at the United Nations, in the General Assembly, and the Security Council.
Shocking.
So this is what I think the plan was, and they're happy that Russia invaded. And the Ukrainian people are the fodder here. They don't give a damn, really. They are being used as a way to get to Russia.
And the people in the world who are no longer reading in-depth pieces about anything, they're hard to find, but they're kind of cheering on what may be the eventual destruction of a lot of civilians in this conflict. I want to turn to Patrick now and talk about a wonderful piece that was in Consortium News by Diana Johnstone, who we actually invited today, but she had I think she was going to be in a place today where there's no Wi-Fi, deep in the heart of France or something, where we should all be right now. But it's a brilliant piece, Patrick. It really kind of changed the way I viewed things too. She puts what's happening in between Ukraine and Russia, and actually the West and Russia really, as a kind of a bear baiting. I didn't know about these, but apparently in the old, maybe Elizabethan court or something, they used to put dogs and a bear together, and they'd bait a kind of a gentle bear into a conflict. Not that Russia's particularly gentle, but they would bait the bear into a conflict and then enjoy the outcome. And she's making a kind of an analogy there. What did you think of the piece she wrote, Patrick? And give me your sort of deep dive on how it explains what's happening today.
Yeah, sure. I didn't know about bear baiting in Elizabethan England, but it was sort of an electrifying metaphor, if that's the word, right? That's exactly what we have been doing. To fill out my reply, let me go to some things Joe was saying about the celebratory atmosphere on Capitol Hill last night, right?
They were taking selfies in Ukrainian colored scarves.
Yeah.
It's not serious, people.
What is the subtext here? What is actually being said? A sound statesman understands that one of the primary responsibilities he or she holds is to understand the perspective of the other side, right? There's no question about that. It's a given in professional diplomacy. What the Americans have been saying all along, and what was said last night, is we don't want to know about the other side, right? Mm-hmm. What we're getting today, last few days, I've been watching, Putin is a madman, right? What is the purpose of that label? The purpose of that label is he doesn't have anything serious we need to understand, right?
Yeah, that's smart.
I go back to the 1945 victories. In the decades after that, Americans didn't have to do anything other than what they were already doing. There was, as Boutros Ghali said in his wonderful memoir, diplomacy is for the weak, the strong have no need for it. What we have in Washington now is the consequence of 70 years of complacency, where we didn't really need diplomacy. And the 21st century requires that of us. And we don't have the wherewithal. We, being the West. Liz Truss, the foreign secretary, are you joking?
Yeah.
Blinken, he surprised me. He's a very well-educated man, but he's a dumbbell, right?
Yeah.
Jake Sullivan, right? We have no diplomatic capacity, right? And we are not the slightest bit interested in understanding the perspectives of others. That does not mean accepting them or buying into them, but it's essential that we do. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere on the Ukraine question or anything else until we realize that we have to develop that capacity.
Well, it requires a level of seriousness and thought that seems to be evaporating very, very quickly, and even accelerating. I mean, I never thought I would be saying that the kind of the national security people in an American administration are not serious people, but they're not serious people. And of course, we learned that with the Afghanistan disaster, but they're not. It's sort of like, how did they get there? When did poking the the Russian bear become more important than making sure, nukes didn't fly and we lived in a reasonably calm world? Like when did that, maybe I'm naive for thinking that was ever the priority. I know it actually wasn't, but it's so extreme now.
Yeah.
And I think if you couple that kind of extremis with the level of propaganda that attends it, it's so disabling. I think people who are awake enough to see what's going on are probably really tormented by what's going on right now.
I mean, Diana's piece had more history and context in a couple of thousand well-edited words than we're ever going to get out of Washington. My code words here are history, chronology, causality, and responsibility. Those are the things we need to get a grip on if we're going to understand what's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere, of course, right? And there's no trace of them in the Western, in the mainstream Western discourse, right? None. They don't want us to have that.
No, they don't. And I think I'll ask you both this question. Do you believe that if the West, specifically Biden and his team, had made a significant, credible promise of no NATO buildup on Russian borders, that this would have been stopped?
In the immediate term, yes. But Putin, and here I think our very useful context is the joint statement Putin and Xi Jinping made on February 4th on the eve of the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
That statement makes it very, very clear that this goes Ukraine, large as it is in magnitude, is actually a subset of a very much larger phenomenon. These two are talking about another kind of a renovated world order, right? Here's I happen to have the statement in front of me, just a couple of sentences. This is their opener. Today, the world is going through momentous changes and humanity is entering an era of rapid development and profound transformation. A trend has emerged toward the redistribution of power in the world. That's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And Putin, he's thinking about something much larger than the particularities of Ukraine, although they are plainly very high in his mind, right? Mm-hmm. I think he has chosen, after 8 years of patience, that this is the moment. I'm not stepping back. We need a cleanup. Everybody in the Western media hikes up their skirts. He's talking about a new security architecture in Europe. Well, exactly. That's precisely what he's talking about. And if you review the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, it's exactly what's needed. It's been a mess over there, right?
Yeah.
One after another.
Joe, let me ask you this. I was watching Colonel McGregor last night, who I have a lot of time for, and he said, and I've heard some other people, that Putin's plan was to go in and do limited damage and have limited casualties, that it was a controlled operation. Obviously now that's over based on what we're seeing. But it's almost as if the West didn't want that to happen, right? That they goaded him into escalating because they weren't, there was no kind of recognition of restraint. It was all Putin's weak. Putin can't win. He's made a mistake. Look at how bad he is. He's evil and stupid, right? So by not recognizing that he was trying to be somewhat strategic, I don't apologize for the invasion, but this is what happened, that he was almost goaded into escalating. Do you think that kind of fits, especially based on Diana's great piece you guys published about poking the bear?
I certainly think they wanted him to enter Ukraine in order to put these incredible sanctions on that. The ultimate aim here is to take down Putin and bring back a pliable president, as the United States had in Boris Yeltsin, during the 1990s in the Clinton administration. Wall Street and Washington moved in, and former Communist Party officials became the oligarchs. They asset stripped the country. America had almost, a very dominant position inside the former Soviet Union. And Putin came along in 1999 on New Year's Eve, and he became president. And by 2007, he made his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference. He said, wait a minute, we can no longer tolerate this U.S. Aggression around the world and the expansion of NATO, because there had been an agreement between Gorbachev and Baker, the Secretary of State for H.W. Bush, that the U.S. would not expand NATO eastward towards Russia in exchange for Gorbachev agreeing to the reunification of Germany and the withdrawal of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. That is now found on paper. That agreement was made. It was broken. And the U.S. has expanded all the way to the border with NATO, which is an arm of the U.S. Military power, all the way up to the borders of Russia. Putin put the line down in 2007. And now we're 15 years later. And it's only gotten worse, and he's not been listened to. He's been humiliated. Russia's been humiliated, not been respected. Their security concerns have not taken into consideration by the West, which it should be by the OSCE treaty. You cannot enhance your security at the expense of another country's. And they just laughed at him when he put those treaties forward saying, take your troops out of Eastern European NATO countries and take those missiles that are out of Poland and Romania that are very close to Moscow. And then, we start talks on a new agreement. Emmanuel Macron went there a few times, and he was the only one of the European leaders who seemed to give any respect at all to that idea that we need a new security architecture, as Patrick was saying, in Europe that includes Russia's security interests. So Russia tried for so long to be cooperative with the partners in the West, and the West just spit on him. And he put these treaties forward and said, if you don't sign them, we could take military technical means. So it was a kind of threat. It was a kind of ultimatum, and they just laughed at him. And guess what? The U.S. wanted that invasion. They wanted that damned invasion. They got the invasion so they could put the sanctions and the world condemnation. And what do they want now? They want to put him, in my view, into a quagmire. So they're sending more arms there. They would like to bog down Russia for years, if possible, to bleed it, just the way the Soviet Union was brought down in a large part because of the quagmire it fell into in Afghanistan. And Brzezinski gave an interview in 1998 or 9 to a French magazine in which he said, we purposely armed the Mujahideen to set a trap. And he used the word trap for the Soviets to come into Afghanistan. And we will continue to arm the Mujahideen. U.S. troops are not going to have to scratch on their finger. But we will bog them down with guerrilla warfare for 8-9 years. And then they will have to withdraw, and it will weaken and bring down the Soviet Union. And that's exactly what happened. He called it giving the Soviets their Vietnam. And I believe what we're seeing now is the U.S. wants to give Russia, Putin's Russia, its Vietnam, to bring it down so they can get the control over the resources and the finances and the markets that they had during the Yeltsin years. So I looked, and this is why going beyond just the Donbass to protect those people there, which may have had a legal argument or not, but going all the way into the country now to destroy all of its military and to take the capital and probably try to restore a government that's friendlier to Russia. I may be going too far for Russia, and they're going deeper and deeper into this U.S. trap, and they're going to try to bleed them dry. And I'll just end here by saying there's another school of thought that it's going to be very painful for Russia in the short term, but long term, because of China and India, this is a different China than the one of 30 years ago. The U.S. knows this, but they're acting as if they're still emerging from colonialism. They are as the second most powerful, obviously, economy in the world. And they, together with Russia, and they've been drawing closer and closer together since the 2014 coup in Ukraine, they can survive. Russia can survive, but we're going to have two separate worlds, two separate financial systems. The SWIFT belongs to the West. They won't be able to do that. They sanctioned the central bank of Russia, so they can't buy Western currencies to support the ruble. There is going to be two separate financial and economic systems. This is what is good. We're in a new era now, it looks like, because of what's happening right now. So Russia can survive maybe with China, maybe not. But I think the idea is to bleed them in a quagmire. And that may or may not happen. But I think that's the U.S. strategy.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, Patrick?
Yeah, I do. I think adding to what Joe said and going back to a remark you made a moment ago, Trish, right? I don't think this invasion requires an apology from anybody. Invasions of any kind are regrettable, yes, But I think this was the right thing to do. I'm not going to apologize for that.
Why
What
do you
he's
say that? People are going to jump all over that comment,
That's
Patrick. So
fine.
you
That's
better
fine.
defend it, friend. You
Yeah,
better
that's fine. Look,
defend it.
he's going in. We've got hundreds of millions of dollars of NATO weapons pouring into Ukraine. As we've already discussed, we've got far right and indeed uh, Nazi like formations in the National Guard.
Yeah.
He's not going in to conquer that country. Read the statements we all have. I want to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. What does demilitarize mean? That means I think he wants to incapacitate the military in Ukraine, such that they can send all these weapons in, but there's going to be no capacity to make use of them. Right? He wants to decapitate the military. It'd be like sending $10 million worth of weapons into Norfolk, Connecticut. Nobody would have any idea what to do with them. Right? That's what I think his objective is, and it's a good objective.
Yeah, it may well be. I just don't think that we can sort of say that now that there are civilians in the line of fire. But theoretically, I agree with what you're saying about the fact that he may have had a legitimate goal at one point. I'm not sure that can be argued now because I might be wrong, but it looks like they are now kind of letting it rip a bit, unless that's more propaganda. I don't know. But what do you think, Joe, about that?
I think I don't know a damn thing about what's going on the ground. And I've come to no conclusion.
There's an honest man. There's an honest man.
I think anybody who says that they do is lying, because we're getting completely different stories. This happens in every war, obviously.
Yeah.
But for example, there was in Kharkiv, there was this explosion yesterday, I believe, in front of that administrative building, and it would look pretty gruesome. At least 10 people died. Cars blown up, facade of the building heavily damaged. Somebody suggested that's only reported as Russia's raining down indiscriminate shells on civilians. Maybe they are, but that would go totally contrary to the stated mission and doesn't make sense, because they want to be able to, the Ukrainian people to respect them and not cause what I was saying is this quagmire, which I think is perhaps coming. But maybe there was fire coming from that area. Now, the Russians are saying, and I have no way of knowing if it's true, that Ukrainian military and some of these far-right militias are operating from within civilian areas. So if you fire from that area, Russia returns fire, hits the building. We don't hear about the first shot that went out. That's possibly, see?
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know.
It's true. And I think nothing that we're hearing coming out of Ukraine has credibility at all. I mean, there were more than, I can just say 3 stories off the top of my head that were total lies. One of them was the one that Zelensky pushed out about this ghost fighter pilot thing that shot down Russian aircraft. Absolutely not true. There was an allegation, or it was kind of an implication rather than an allegation, that the Russians had taken Chernobyl and were releasing radiation. That turned out not to be true. And then there were the people who were about to be taken prisoner by Russians who said F you, and then they were all killed. Also not true. Also pushed by Zelensky. So it's like and then there was also a fake picture, a picture of a building that had been destroyed years ago by some other conflict, and then they were saying it's happening now. I mean, I'm just, my head is spinning. I just can't figure out what is actually true and what isn't true. And I think that, demonizing Putin, look, he's done bad things, but so has America. And we have to stop looking at conflict that way, right? Like the civilians killed in Iraq, no one was really going after America on that in the mainstream media in a big way, right? So I don't think anybody has the moral high ground here. And failing anybody having the moral high ground, one has to look at what the stated purpose of this is, which is that Putin was feeling insecure. Promises were made to make him feel more secure. Those promises weren't kept. And I think this is the key thing I want my viewers today to really understand, that Ukraine is not a plucky little democracy operating the way we all dream a democracy would, right? It is a client state of America, which has been meddling in there for years, right? So please, someone expand a little bit. You talked about Victoria Nuland in 2014 and this coup, right? But if you could expand a little bit more about how America has been meddling around in there for a very long time against the eastern part of the country, which is the part that primarily favors being part of Russia.
Patrick, if you don't mind, I just want to quickly
Go
say
ahead. Yeah.
that the day after the coup, an American citizen who was a former State Department official was made the finance minister of Ukraine.
Oh,
Joe
I remember
Biden-
that.
Yeah, Joe Biden was made the czar, basically the viceroy of Obama, to run Ukraine. And we could do 10 shows, and we've already done it, about his son getting that job on the gas board, which we in Consortium News wrote about in 2014 while it was happening. This wasn't some electoral thing for us. We were reporting on it. They had, and don't forget, Biden said at that Council of Foreign Relations meeting that he demanded the firing of that prosecutor who has testified in a court that he was going to investigate Biden's son's company. And he demanded his firing, and he got that firing, and he was proud of that. Biden.
He boasted about it. He boasted about it.
They run that country. They run it completely. That is a absolute colony of the United States.
Listen, I had the strangest experience some while ago. My desk being a mess, I came across this clipping. It's by a New York Times reporter named Joel Brinkley. Joel Brinkley went other ways years ago. What is this clip? It was from 2004. At that time, the Senate was questioning the administration. What are we doing with all this money piling into NGOs active in Ukraine? Back then, people got a little bit upset about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right? We've been at it a long, long time. The Newland tape and all that.
Yeah.
That's one part of a much, much larger, lengthier campaign here, right?
And I think if you pull the lens back a little bit too, because we take these incidences in little bites, and then they seem to get memory hold, and we don't really connect the dots when things like this happen. But if you think about the fact that clearly there was funny business around Hunter Biden's deal with Burisma, there was some evidence in the laptop that money was being channeled further down the line in the Biden family, meaning Joe, who is now the president.
Guy.
Right. And so it's almost like he should not be running the foreign policy, because if this was a company, right, they'd say, you got a conflict, dude. You can't. But no one's connecting. No one's even talking about that. I mean, it's really strange.
Of course not. You couldn't talk about it during the election, remember?
I do.
The New York Post got the platform from Twitter. I just want to add something to what Patrick said. It goes back to the 1950s. Now, Stepan Bandera was a fascist Ukrainian leader in the West who joined first with the Nazis and was responsible for killing thousands of Jews and Poles during the war. He was a fascist, a literal one, working with the Nazis. He then split with the Nazis. In 1952, the KGB assassinated him. He is the hero of these groups today. They march with torches through the streets of Kiev with the picture of Stepan Bandera. So what did the U.S. do after the war? They started working with some of these Ukrainian Nazis, literal ones from the war, to try to undermine the Soviet Union. The U.S. has a long history of working with ex-Nazis. That's a big story, but they did work with Ukrainian Nazis as well to try to undermine the Soviet Union. So this kind of thing has been going on since the end of the Second World War, just to push Patrick's story back even further.
Well, foreign policy has strange bedfellows, right? I mean,
You know, Trish, I think one of the things I would like to share with your viewers and listeners is that we need to make an effort to separate ourselves from the barrage, the incessant shower of caricature and distortion surrounding this. Putin is a tyrant. Well, I don't know whether I like Putin or not. I disqualify myself as a Russianist. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly happy to say he's an extraordinary statesman with a grasp of history that and nobody in Washington could even approach, right?
Yeah.
And pick any one of his speeches. It would be completely beyond the Biden administration or any other, right? To make a comparable presentation, right? We need to step back from all that, try, as I was urging earlier, to understand this, sort of removing ourselves from our Western consciousness, right? And try to understand what it looks like from the other side and whether there are reasons for this happening, and then whether they are good reasons for this happening.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, okay, but you're not saying good reasons for war, right? You're not saying that. But good
is
reasons.
Is there something wrong? Are you a Gandhian or something?
Kind of.
Are all wars awful? Well,
maybe,
all wars
yeah.
are awful. Are all wars unjust?
I don't know if I'm smart enough to answer that question, Patrick, but I totally understand what you're saying, that Putin was motivated by feeling insecure, and the insecurity was driven purposefully by the West. So when he reacts to feeling insecure, having been lied to about being promised security, I totally get it. Like that's what we
the
need
bear
to
bite. That's the bear baiting bit.
That's what we need to fully take on. And it's never worked out ever for us to demonize people on the other side. It didn't work out with Saddam Hussein, probably a nut, but he wasn't doing what they said he was doing. And that was completely misbegotten, that war. It was a disaster for everybody. And so now we're going down that road again. And I want to say that, because I know you both have thought about this in connection to what's happening in Ukraine right now, and that's the 5 years of Trump is Putin's puppet, and Putin's meddling in our election, and Putin hacked the election, all that stuff. Like, how does that play into the apparent glee we are seeing now in a certain part of the citizenry who want to go get this guy because he's an enemy of our people? I mean, it's just that rhetoric was so irresponsible. It nearly drove me mad.
Consortium News has done an extraordinary job hanging on to the Russiagate story. So I invite Joe to respond to that.
Yeah.
Oh, well, one of our best writers on that was Patrick Lawrence, who was one of the first, if not the first, in a piece in Salon to explain, to catch on to what was going on. Because this began during the convention, right? Isn't that right, Patrick? Why don't you tell that?
Yeah.
Story?
What we had with the Clinton mail leaks, they were not hacks.
Leaks, not hacks. I'm with you.
Was an attempt to deflect attention from the contents of those, and the clever ruse was to assign it as a hacked by the Russians. Okay, already by that time, the national security cliques were rather worried about Trump because he was making noises about détente with Russia and an end to our wars of adventure and so on. So they had common cause. The media did what the media always does. And we had a three-sided alliance that prolonged the Russiagate fiasco for a very long time. Now, my theory is that when they concocted that fable, they figured it only has to last until Hillary is elected, and then we can let it go away, right? My analogy is, what do they call them? Product tolerances, okay? If you take a children's toy, right, it's built to last a couple of weeks and the kid's going to break it. If you take a tank, it's built to last many years, right?
Yeah. Planned obsolescence, I think, is the phrase, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
The Russiagate fable was only built to last a few months. And then Hillary lost to the shock of everybody. And it had to go on and on and
I
on
agree.
and
That's
on,
smart.
and
Yeah.
became more preposterous as it went along. And the destructiveness of this, I'm not the first one to point this out, right? Aaron Mate and others have done a great job with
He's
it.
terrific. Yeah.
The destructiveness of the Russiagate mess.
Oh.
There's a straight line from that to this conversation this morning. Maybe Joe has more.
Well, let me just chime in and say I thought it was incredibly reckless, and nukes are kind of on the table right now. And are we going to be able, whichever ones of us survive, to trace a nuclear exchange back to Hillary Clinton doing false Oppo research in order? Like, is this where
No, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
But the tension created by Russiagate certainly has contributed to all this without a question. And Robert Parry, who founded Consortium News, is the founder and editor, who I succeeded as editor-in-chief, has been credited by Aaron Mate, and anybody who knows anything about Russiagate as being in the forefront of this. And one of the things he pointed out was these tensions, and he even talked about nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine. And he wrote that in 2015. I just republished that yesterday on our website, because you need to see how he put together. He has all about the neo-Nazis and even Islamists that were going there to fight too. And by the way, skinheads and white supremacists from all over the world have gone to train with these guys. It's sort of the mecca right now for white supremacy. Ukraine, and nuclear weapons was one of the things. Well, nuclear war was one of the risks that was intended to this, that Russiagate was helping to stir up. I always thought that was a little far out when Bob wrote that back then, but no, he's completely right. And Putin said, you come anywhere near my operation, he made it clear he could use nuclear weapons. And I think he's serious. I don't think this is Nixon's madman theory. Nixon had this theory that he told Kissinger, we hear it on the tape, that just act like you're crazy in the middle of a negotiation, like with the Vietnamese or with the Russians or with the Chinese. Just act crazy all of a sudden. You're going to drop bombs everywhere and they'll get scared, and we can win that point in the negotiation. I think that Scott Ritter, who's been writing for us, the military analyst, said, this is not, I asked him, he said, this is not Nixon's madman theory. This is serious. And I think the people in Washington may not be taking it seriously.
I think they're not taking
enough.
it seriously. Yeah, me too.
And I'm really dead scared. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 6 years old, going under the desk in my first grade classroom. I didn't really know what the hell was going on. I knew adults were quite nervous, but we knew it was something serious. This is terrifying. I don't want to speak about it as hyperbole. I think it's real. I think there's something we have to be, and the U.S. needs to know that they've got to get a ceasefire there. They have to make Ukraine a neutral country. They've got to pull back their missiles from Eastern Europe. Don't forget, this is like the missile crisis too in '62, because it all began when the U.S. put nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey. Soviets asked them to remove them. The U.S. said no. They put missiles in Cuba. How does it feel to have these missiles close to you? Ultimately, quietly, Kennedy had those missiles removed from Turkey and Italy, and that's when the Soviets removed their weapons from Cuba. But in the history books, Americans think that was just a great victory by the Americans, humiliating the Soviets. Not at all. And I had hoped that maybe Putin would put missiles in Venezuela right now, or Cuba again, to try to solve this issue. But he took the military route, I think, because that offensive began. He tried to stop it. Hope it wasn't a huge mistake for Russia and for Ukraine. It looks terrible, but again, I don't know what's going on the ground.
No one does, sadly.
But nuclear war is something not to laugh about right now.
Well, no, and they're not talking about it. It's just, I had a thought this morning, again, not to be hyperbolic about it, but I have a kid away at university in another city, and I thought for a minute, should I be bringing him home? Like, I actually thought that for a minute. Like, if this thing, I know it's too much, but I feel sort of helpless because the serious people are not talking about this as if it's a serious problem. And I can see the people that Biden surrounds himself with in Washington really making a big mistake here. Can't you?
Yes. But I think the reference to nuclear weapons, Putin's reference to nuclear weapons, he was very careful to use the word deterrence. In other words, I'm not going to use these, but I need my deterrent now, right?
Hmm.
I think that was really, of all the surprising things that have happened in the last little while, that was really quite shocking, and I reckon a miscalculation. I
Yeah.
wonder what Joe thinks, or you, Trish. That was little OTT, if you ask me. He shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I know Professor Cohen, Steve Cohen said in 2019 that he had concerns and also, you know what I listened to this morning in preparation for this was the John Mearsheimer U Chicago video, which is it's a pretty good history, right?
Yeah, I got a lot of time for Mearsheimer.
I'm going to recommend that to our listeners. Do we have any time left? Do we have 10 minutes or no? Do you guys have 10 minutes? Because I do.
Sure.
The one thing I want to clarify, because this is it sounds so extreme to people who haven't been following, is the Nazi thing. So I just want to be clear who they are. And this is not people using the word Nazi the way they do over here, where everybody's a Nazi, right? But these are actually like literally Nazis, right? Is that right?
Yeah, they're Nazis, not
Right.
even neo-Nazis.
I know, Joe, I used to say neo-Nazis, and then I tried crypto-Nazis for a while, and then I decided, hell with it, Nazis.
Yeah, and Steve Cohen wrote about them. It was quite, I'm just going to read this bit. It says, Professor Stephen Cohen, acclaimed as America's leading authority on Russia, wrote, the program, like burning to death of ethnic Russians and others in Odessa, this, I think, was the building that caught fire.
Dreadful.
Yes.
Terrible story. And just also to be clear that the Nazis they're talking about are against the people who are allied with Russia. It's not the Russians who are the Nazis, it's the people against the Russians, right?
Yes.
Just to make clear.
Yes.
Because, the media grabs it the wrong way. And he says it reawakened memories of Nazi extermination squads in Ukraine during World War II, right? Storm-like assaults on gays, Jews, elderly ethnic Russians, and other, in quotes, impure citizens are widespread throughout Kiev-ruled Ukraine, along with torchlight marches reminiscent of those that eventually inflamed Germany in the late 1920s and 1930s. And then he goes on to talk about a little bit more about how there were so many Ukrainian collaborators with Nazi German extermination, et cetera, but it's real, and I think people maybe think that it's not real. He also writes in that piece, actually this is John Pilger, I think, but the United Nations tabled a resolution that called for combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism. The only nations to vote against it were the United States and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the idea that this is a perfect little happy democracy of diverse people who all love each other is also not true, right?
Look, the reason people may have difficulty accepting this and may be inclined to take it as hyperbolic is because it's been the phenomenon has been systematically airbrushed out of the story, the power of leaving out, for 8 years, right? I don't know how thick on the ground they are, but I'm quite certain that the government in Kiev, Zelensky, Poroshenko before him, are highly dependent on these groups for national security. There's no question of that. However, whatever their number,
they're afraid of them. They're also afraid of them.
Really?
Yeah, they battled them early on in 2014. They were incorporated into the National Guard because they were so powerful. There's only about 1,000 Azov battalion who are based in Mariupol, which is apparently being bombarded. And all we hear about the Russians are sending missiles into this poor innocent city that's where the base of Azov battalion is. Yeah. Again, I don't want to talk about what's going on the ground because I have no bloody clue what's going on the ground. Yeah. I just hear all these different stories. But it is a real problem, and they do dismiss it like it's a joke. And you made a very good point, Trish, that the N word is used, the Nazi word is just thrown around. You're a Nazi, they're a fascist. Everybody's a fascist. I mean, it diluted the meaning of the word. And here in Ukraine, it really applies.
There are Nazis and there are fascists. Yeah, there are.
Yes.
They actually exist. They're real. They're real.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Russia's not paranoid about this.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up in a second, but I did also want to just run by you something that I read this morning as well, and that's that John Brennan, our old friend who pushed Russiagate night after night, is it true that he was helping to coordinate the coup in 2014? Was that his baby?
Yes,
I have to
he
go
did
to
a-
Joe with that. I don't know.
Yes, he did. He made a very important trip over there that he was asked about and finally admitted it was true. He went there just weeks before the coup. And Joe Biden, I believe, also went there. And he went many times after that because he was put in charge of Ukraine by Obama. And give Obama, it was under his administration this coup took place. But then I think he tried to contain what he unleashed by refusing to send weapons.
Obama did?
Obama refused to send weapons to Ukraine after that. So they overthrew it. He saw what was going on in the East and he didn't send any more weapons. And that pissed off Brzezinski, who was still alive then, wrote a piece about this. He wanted American troops to go to Ukraine after the coup because Ukraine is what he lusted after. That was the key to eat Eurasia, to the entire Eurasian landmass was to get Ukraine. That's his theory. So here they were. They got the coup and he wanted weapons, American troops there. Obama said no, and he was an advisor to Obama then. And what happened when Trump came along? Remember at the Republican National Committee, there was this scandal that Trump changed the platform from sending weapons to not sending weapons because the Republicans wanted to send them at that time and Obama didn't. In other words, Trump agreed with Obama. That was a Democratic Obama's policy.
Yeah.
But the media is so corrupt that they saw that smart move by Trump as the fact that he was Putin's puppet or something. That's how they phrase it, right?
Look, I hope that you stay on the air, Trish, because we're in a really dangerous zone here where that music conductor was fired simply because he didn't say anything, not because of what he said.
Incredible.
You demanded he renounce Putin. He wouldn't open his mouth and they fired him.
Beyond
and
belief,
and we are seeing Russian media, which is Russian media, and American media. They leave things out in Russian media too, but we got to get both sides of the story. That's 101 journalism. We can't hear we're only allowed to hear the U.S. and Western narrative right now, firing people, shutting down journalists. This already started with Russiagate too. This has been building, but now it's on steroids. It's very, very scary time right now.
Yeah. Joe, I would say transcending the we and they, the self and other is 101 journalism. It's 101 diplomacy, and it's something all people, all Americans need to get to work on.
Al, here's my last question to you guys. Is this fixable before it all goes completely to rat shit and there's no way back? Is it?
I think so.
Are there back channel meetings right now, do you think?
It has to be dense with those. My eye is on the talks on the Belarusian Ukrainian border. I think Zelensky wants to settle up, but you can't really tell. It appears that Washington will do anything it can to scuttle those talks.
Yeah, it's feeling that way.
I agree with exactly what Patrick said about putting yourself in the other man's shoes. And that is the key to diplomacy and to journalism, international journalism, which is never done. You have to try to look at it the way Russians look at it, how an Arab nation looks at these things. And that's very difficult for Westerners to do mostly because for a number of reasons. But you're right. What's going on the border, the talks, they don't want to. Zelensky said we won't surrender because what I hear, and I have no idea again if it's true, that Russia wants to encircle Kiev and wait them out for them to surrender before moving in. And there has to be a deal right now. The Americans should take seriously all the further consequences of this and hope that those sanctions they've put on already, which are pretty much all they can, they'll keep them on for a long time to try to destroy the Russian economy. So they got what they wanted. They have to resist the idea of pouring more weapons in, French fighter planes taking off from Poland to try to entrap Russia into a quagmire there. I'm hoping that they realize that's enough. We got the sanctions on. We got the invasion. We needed to do that. Now let's settle and work where maybe they can withdraw to the Dnieper River and that the eastern part is going to be somehow under the sphere of Russia again. I don't see that happening very simply, but that's what needs to happen. Something
Well,
along those lines.
Well, I agree with you. I think the problem, though, is that they've created a monster in public opinion now. They've so propagandized the
Oh, yeah.
people
Yeah,
in
well said,
favor,
well said.
right? In favor of, save Ukraine at all costs and don't let Putin have a win at any cost. And it's now politically unpopular for them to do the right thing. People are actually cheering for their own demise in a war,
Yeah, I know.
right? It's nuts.
I've said this before in other contexts. It's sad to say, but the truth of it outweighs the sadness. I really hope the United States fails.
Yeah.
That's the bitter truth of it.
Yeah, I understand that sentiment. I really do. We need a working media again. We need serious people in positions of power. We can't be, Biden was never a serious person. Obama didn't think he was a serious person. How the hell did this guy who's got a corrupt relationship with a bunch of countries end up we know how the corrupt media put him in. I mean,
it's really weird, isn't
it? It's got to stop. Like this,
he spent 50 years selling snake oil off the back of a buck wagon, right? And here he is, the president of everything. Unbelievable.
I know.
He's scary when he thinks he knows a subject and he thinks he knows Ukraine. I think he's quite a shallow thinker, in my opinion. But when he has an issue that he's been involved with, and he has been, then he starts getting like, I know what I'm talking about here. And that's really troubling to me. As far as we need a media, Trish, plug Consortium News was started in 1995 by Robert Perry. He was an AP investigative reporter, broke the biggest Iran-Contra stories, including the identity of Oliver North. That was Bob Perry who did that. But the AP spiked his stories, and so did Newsweek. So we started this alternative media for mainstream journalists who are having their story spiked. I was working at the Wall Street Journal, have my story spiked when I started giving Bob my articles. And here's Patrick Dunn from International Herald Tribune. Our deputy editor is a former Dow Jones editor. So we come out of it. We have a CIA whistleblower, John Kiriakou, is also one of our big columnists. Yeah. We come out of the mainstream, what we saw what happened, and we are opposed very much to it. Yeah. But we have the experience of being on the inside and objecting.
The professional standards of Consortium are one of its greatest assets, and if I may say, a distinguishing mark. I'm all for independent media, but standards are very important.
Oh, are they ever? Listen, I know, because we could I'm obviously independent media, but I see a lot of independent media that's not kind of doing the journalism part. And so that's not good either. But listen, you guys, this is your moment. I feel this is your moment. You can kind of own this, right? Because you don't have much competition here. And
but you know what the scary thing is, Trish? Our readership has exploded right now.
Has it really, Joe? That's nice to know.
No, but it's dangerous because since we're under the radar and we're fringe, nobody's paying attention. But we are saying the kinds of things that have gotten other media shut down and conductors fired. So I'm afraid of attacks against us. I'm talking about cyber attacks. We have been in the past already. So this is something that's concerning. The more influence we have, the more likely we are to be attacked. But we have to continue to do that. And we are a source for a lot of people, and we're hungry for a different point of view, whether they agree with the various points of view we point out. We don't have just one point of view. We don't have an ideology at Consortium News. We have writers of different perspectives on this, and we write news, and we try to bring a nuanced understanding to these events. So this is a moment for people to come and see a different way of looking at Ukraine from, I don't even know what the American television is saying because I refuse to watch.
It's hopeless. It's the same thing. It's individual stories of plucky Ukrainians, individual stories of terrible Russian deeds, no analysis, no context. Putin is Hitler, la, 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 la. I mean, that's what it is. Like I said to you, I am now at the point in this, because I've just gone through 2 years of COVID coverage as well, which was really terrible. I'm a medical reporter sort of historically, so that was my sweet spot. But it's the same, it's a set narrative. Everything fits the set narrative, and that's where we're stuck. And I honestly, like I said at the beginning of this, I couldn't even watch the Joe Biden State of the Union because I knew I wouldn't sleep and I had to get up to talk to you guys. So I waited till this morning. Anyway, thanks so much. Keep on going. Just also, the Mearsheimer video, it's kind of, unless you're heavily interested in Ukraine, it's probably boring for most people, right? It's up to 13 million listeners today.
I'm delighted.
Viewers.
I think Mearsheimer has it wrong on China, but we'll leave that aside.
Yeah, but he's got a good history, and it means people are diving into. I think it's 2 hours long.
Wow.
Right? It's like and there's 13 million people have looked at it. So this is uplifting for me.
Yeah.
And
Good
they're
on
finding
you.
you guys too. They're finding you guys too. So
Well,
that's great.
Bless you for having us. You're very welcome for the time.
Thank you,
Happy
Trish.
to. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, you guys. Keep
Bye.
on going. Keep going.
Shall.
Okay.
Shall.
Okay.
Bye.
All
Bye,
the
Joe.
best. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye, Patrick. Good talk to you.
Right.